Henry Blake was boarding his private jet when he saw a little girl crying on the airport floor. Minutes later, he missed his flight, and nothing in his life was ever the same again. Henry Blake sat in the airport's VIP lounge with his legs crossed, his laptop open, and a noise-canceling earpiece tucked into his left ear. His pale gray suit was flawless, his blonde hair neatly combed back, and his sharp blue eyes focused entirely on the numbers flickering across the screen. He was a man who didn't waste time, not on small talk, not on travel delays, and certainly not on strangers. His life operated on efficiency, flights, mergers, strategy, silence. The outside world, with all its chaos and emotion, was kept at a controlled distance. But today, something broke through that distance in the most unexpected way. As his boarding group was called over the intercom, Henry reached for his briefcase and stood. Just as he turned toward the gate, a sound stopped him. It wasn't loud, just soft, stuttering sobs, but in the sterile quiet of the lounge, it was unmistakable. He looked toward the source. Near the edge of the seating area, a little girl was sitting on the polished floor, curled up beside a small white bag and a worn stuffed bunny. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her white dress looked slightly wrinkled, and her curly blonde hair framed her face in soft, tangled strands. Tiny white clips barely held the hair back from her pale forehead. Her shoulders shook as she cried, trying to muffle the sound into the bunny's fabric. People were watching. Some glanced, some frowned, but no one moved. No one asked. No one helped. Henry hesitated. This wasn't his problem. His plane was boarding, his schedule was packed, and he had already lost 3 minutes. But his feet didn't move toward the gate. They turned instead toward her. He knelt slowly, loosening his tie slightly, unsure why he felt nervous. "Are you lost?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and low. The girl looked up with wide, glassy blue eyes that mirrored his own more than he realized. She sniffled, clutched the bunny tighter, and shook her head. "Mommy went to the bathroom and didn't come back," she said. "She told me to stay here." "I did. But she didn't come back." Henry looked around. No adult nearby seemed even remotely connected to the girl. There was a small pink jacket folded on the seat behind her and a woman's handbag beside it, but otherwise, nothing. He frowned, reaching for his phone. "What's your name?" he asked, already pulling up security services. The girl answered softly, "Lily." The name hit him like a slow, quiet punch. Lily. Not unfamiliar. Familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. As he spoke to the airport staff and they began checking security footage, Henry stayed near her. He offered her water, which she refused. He asked if she wanted to sit on a chair. She said no, her mother had told her not to move. She obeyed perfectly. An hour passed before security came back with footage. A woman, blonde and thin, holding Lily's hand, entered the restroom area. No footage showed her leaving. Eventually, after a search, she was found unconscious in a service hallway behind the restrooms. Overdose. Emergency services arrived. Henry heard the paramedic mention the name on her ID and stopped breathing for a second. Melanie Brooks. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 6 years. But it wasn't a name you forget. Not when it belonged to the only woman who ever got under his skin, then vanished without a trace. Melanie. And now this little girl, Lily, sitting on the floor in front of him, was her daughter. He watched her as she picked at the fur on her bunny's ear. The tears had dried, but she still looked terrified, hollowed out by confusion and something more ancient than any child should feel. Henry couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when a long-buried name had just taken on a face. He sat down beside Lily and said gently, "You don't have to wait alone anymore." He missed his flight. And for the first time in years, he didn't care. Henry didn't take Lily home right away. Instead, he arranged for a private hotel suite near the hospital where Melanie had been admitted. The staff had tried to offer alternatives, a social worker, a temporary shelter, but Henry refused them all. There was no hesitation in his voice when he said he would be responsible for the child. The moment he heard Melanie's name, a part of him that had been buried deep under years of control and emotional detachment snapped awake, and he knew, without evidence or explanation, that Lily was his daughter. He couldn't prove it yet, but his instincts had never spoken so loudly. Lily clung to her stuffed bunny as they rode silently in the back of his black car. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. Occasionally, she would glance at Henry, but she didn't ask questions. She had the look of someone who had learned to stay quiet and invisible. Henry, watching her through the mirror, felt something tight settle in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. When they reached the hotel, he gently led her inside. The staff recognized him immediately. Mr. Blake was a known figure in the business world, and offered their best suite. He asked for a quiet floor, room service on standby, and absolute privacy. Once inside the suite, he showed Lily the bedroom, the television, the balcony she wasn't allowed to go out on without him. She nodded to everything, not really reacting, as though her body was present but her mind was floating elsewhere. He ordered her a warm dinner, something simple, a grilled cheese sandwich and soup. She sat at the edge of the couch and ate with small, careful bites, still holding the bunny with one arm. Henry sat across from her with a plate of untouched food. He watched her more than he spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you remember your mom talking about someone named Henry?" he asked. Lily looked up, a piece of bread paused in her hand. She thought for a second, then nodded slowly. She said he was someone from before. Someone she missed, even when she didn't say it. Henry felt the air go still. Melanie hadn't just disappeared. She had carried a part of him with her. And now that part was sitting across from him, quiet and unsure, needing someone who didn't vanish. He tucked her into bed that night, awkwardly at first. He wasn't used to brushing small teeth or finding the right storybook voice. She chose a picture book from the hotel's children's selection, and he read it stiffly, until she interrupted him halfway through and whispered, "You don't have to be good at it. Just don't stop reading." He didn't. After she fell asleep, clutching her bunny and breathing in soft patterns, Henry stepped into the other room and made the call. A private medical lab he had used before, discreet and fast. He requested a DNA test. He gave his own sample immediately, and arranged to have Lily's collected in the morning, gently, without frightening her. He knew he could wait for answers, but in his gut, he already had them. He stood by the window of the suite for a long time, watching the dark city move beyond the glass. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, his board, his lawyers. He ignored them all. Nothing in his perfectly structured empire felt as important as the tiny girl asleep behind the door. The pieces didn't make sense yet, but the weight of it had already settled in his bones. Whether the test confirmed it or not, Henry knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. The DNA results arrived in less than 48 hours. Henry hadn't told Lily about the test, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he knew that labeling what they already felt wouldn't change how he was treating her. Still, when the envelope arrived by private courier, his heart beat harder than he expected. He opened it alone, standing at the desk in the hotel suite study area while Lily watched a cartoon quietly in the next room, her bunny still never far from reach. The result was printed in clear, clinical language: 99.9% probability of paternity. Henry sat down slowly, the page trembling slightly in his hands. He was her biological father. It was now a fact, not just a feeling. The weight of that knowledge didn't bring relief as much as it brought clarity. He hadn't just stumbled into someone else's crisis. He had found his child, and she had been alone in the world for far too long. He thought about all the years he'd spent chasing perfection, his reputation, his empire, his image, while his daughter had been growing up without him, with no idea who he was or why he had never come. The guilt didn't hit him all at once, but it seeped into every thought, quiet and steady, reshaping everything. That afternoon, he picked her up from where she sat drawing on hotel stationery and asked if she wanted to go for a walk. She nodded. They walked through a nearby park in silence for a while, Lily holding his hand but still keeping her gaze down, the way children do when they don't yet trust that the world will remain kind. Eventually, she stopped and pointed at a small bench by a fountain. They sat together, and after a long pause, she asked, "Is Mommy going to die?" Her voice wasn't dramatic or frightened, it was calm, resigned, too heavy for someone her age. Henry didn't lie. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But the doctors are doing everything they can to help her." She nodded. "She told me once that if something ever happened to her, I should find someone named Henry. But I didn't know how. I just waited." She looked up at him for the first time with something like hope, not trust yet, but the start of it. "Are you him?" "Yes," he said, his voice catching. "I am." She leaned against him without another word, her small shoulder resting against his chest like she was testing to see if he was real. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stayed there, letting her decide how much closeness she could take. It wasn't affection that struck him then, it was awe. Somehow, she had found her way to him without even knowing it. Later that evening, back at the hotel, he contacted his legal team. He needed to begin the process of formal guardianship immediately. With Melanie unconscious and unable to provide consent, it would take paperwork, hearings, background checks, and court approval. He didn't care how long it would take. He would do it right. He also reached out to a child psychologist, arranging for an evaluation and emotional support for Lily in the coming days. He wanted her to feel safe, not just fed and housed. He wanted her to know she mattered. She had gone too long surviving. Now, she deserved to begin healing. That night, when he tucked her into bed, she turned toward him and asked, "Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question came out softly, almost like a whisper she was afraid to believe in. "I'll be here every day," he said. "As long as you want me." She didn't answer right away. But then she nodded once, closed her eyes, and reached out with one hand to hold onto his sleeve as she drifted to sleep. Henry didn't move. He sat there beside her, still wearing his suit jacket, her fingers curled in the fabric, and he understood something he never had before: he wasn't rescuing her. She was saving him, too. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm, quiet but meaningful. Henry extended their stay in the hotel suite while renovations quietly began in his penthouse to prepare a permanent home for Lily, one with a bedroom designed just for her, soft lighting, safety latches, and space for toys and books she hadn't yet picked. But until that space was ready, he did his best to make the hotel feel like more than just a temporary shelter. Lily adapted quickly to the quiet luxury of their surroundings, not in the way of a child dazzled by wealth, but with the quiet gratitude of someone who had been cold before and now felt warmth. She asked few questions, never demanded anything, and often looked to Henry for silent permission before doing even the simplest things, like reaching for a juice box or turning on the television. It broke something in him every time she hesitated like that, as though kindness was still something she hadn't learned to trust. He made it his mission not just to care for her needs but to offer presence, the kind that didn't expect anything in return. He read to her every night, even when he had meetings that ran long or calls that waited unanswered. He began waking up early, not to review financial reports, but to learn how to braid hair by watching online tutorials so that when she asked, he could get it almost right. The first time she smiled wide enough to show her front tooth missing, he realized it was the first full smile he had seen from her. Their conversations grew longer and more personal. She told him about her bunny, which she had named Sky, because it was the same color as the sky she used to see through her bedroom window when she was scared at night. She shared that her favorite food was pancakes, but only if they were soft in the middle, and that she was scared of hospitals, not because of needles, but because she had once waited in one for hours without knowing if her mother would ever come back. Henry listened to everything. He didn't always know what to say, but he never dismissed a single word. The more she opened up, the more fiercely protective he became, not just because she was his daughter, but because she was finally learning what it felt like to be heard. Meanwhile, Melanie remained unconscious in the hospital. Henry visited her daily, even if only for a few minutes. He sat at her bedside, told her about Lily's day, and updated her on the legal progress. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he spoke anyway, not out of obligation but because part of him needed her to know that he was finally doing what he should have done long ago. He had no bitterness toward her anymore. Only sorrow, for the years they had lost, for the weight she must have carried alone, for the fear that had made her disappear. One afternoon, after a hospital visit, Henry brought Lily to a small bookstore. It was raining lightly outside, and she held his hand tighter as they crossed the wet pavement. Inside, the air smelled like paper and warmth. Lily wandered carefully through the children's section, her fingers brushing across covers like they were made of something fragile. She finally picked out a book about a fox who found its way home after being lost in the woods. That night, she asked Henry to read it twice. When he finished the second time, she whispered, "Do you think the fox knew where he was going?" He paused, then answered, "I think the fox didn't know, but he followed something inside him. And it led him to exactly where he was meant to be." She nodded as if that made perfect sense, then curled up under her blanket and drifted to sleep. The next morning, Henry received confirmation from his legal team. The petition for emergency guardianship had been approved. It was temporary, but it was official. He was now, in the eyes of the law, Lily's legal guardian. He folded the document slowly, not because he doubted the outcome, but because holding it felt like holding a second chance with his own hands. When he told Lily the news, she didn't cheer or jump up and down. She simply smiled softly and said, "So now I get to stay." Henry knelt in front of her and looked into her eyes. "You never have to leave again," he said. And for the first time, she reached out without hesitation and hugged him, arms tight around his neck, as if she had been waiting her whole life for someone to say those words and truly mean them. The penthouse was ready within 2 weeks, transformed from a minimalist, sterile bachelor space into a place that could now be called a home. Gone were the chrome edges, the cold light, and the sharp silence. In their place were warm rugs, softer furniture, a kitchen that smelled like actual meals, and a bedroom down the hall that Lily chose every detail of, from the color of the walls to the shape of the nightlight. Henry had never cared about interior design beyond aesthetics, but now he found himself researching safe drawer locks, non-toxic paints, and the best bedtime books for 5-year-olds. His calendar, once filled with investment briefings and mergers, now included field trip dates, parent forms, and a daily reminder labeled, "Pick up Lily." Their first day in the new home was quiet but full of meaning. Lily explored slowly, taking her time to look at everything. Her favorite thing turned out to be a small window seat in the corner of her room where she could curl up with her bunny and watch the city lights come on at night. Henry watched her without interrupting, standing in the hallway as she touched the edge of a shelf and tested the softness of her blanket. It was the first time he saw her act like a child simply experiencing comfort, not survival. In the days that followed, they built new routines. Pancake Sundays became sacred, even when the pancakes came out uneven or burned. Henry learned to laugh when Lily smeared whipped cream on his nose. On weekday mornings, she insisted on brushing her own hair, then asked him to fix it after, which usually meant starting over but pretending she had done most of the work. Evenings were spent with coloring books, simple puzzles, or reading together. Lily had a quiet sense of humor, and she started to let it show more often, tiny smirks, sarcastic observations far too advanced for her age, and the occasional giggle fit that ended in hiccups. Henry had never known how much joy could come from a child's laugh until he heard hers echoing through his once silent apartment. But not every moment was light. One evening, as Henry was finishing dishes, he found Lily crouched behind the couch, shaking. When he reached her, she wouldn't speak, just held her bunny tight to her chest. Eventually, through choked whispers, she said she had spilled juice on her rug and thought she would be punished. Henry sat on the floor beside her, not touching her yet, and asked gently who had punished her for accidents before. She didn't answer, but the way she flinched told him everything he needed to know. He told her firmly, but softly, that in this home, mistakes were allowed, and no one would ever be hurt for being human. She stared at him as if trying to measure whether she could believe him. He didn't ask her to. He simply cleaned the rug, handed her a fresh glass of juice, and kept the evening quiet. By bedtime, she had come to him and asked if he would sit beside her until she fell asleep. As weeks passed, Henry continued to visit Melanie in the hospital, though she remained unconscious. He brought her updates, pictures Lily had drawn, stories from their daily life, even silly anecdotes about burnt breakfasts. He talked to her like she could hear, like she might open her eyes any minute and see what had grown in her absence. He didn't know what would happen when she woke up, or how she would feel about the new family forming in her shadow. But he knew one thing with clarity: he wanted to be there when she did. And he wanted to be the man who could look her in the eye and say, "I stayed." One evening, Henry received a call from his attorney confirming the court had scheduled a formal custody review. Though the temporary guardianship had gone smoothly, the presence of a living, though incapacitated, mother meant the court would need to assess everything before finalizing full custody. Henry wasn't surprised, but the weight of the process pressed on him. It would mean background investigations, psychological evaluations, more interviews with Lily, and most likely, a social worker's observation of their life together. It would mean proving he was good enough, not as a CEO, but as a father. That night, when he sat beside Lily in her room as she fell asleep, he didn't read a book. Instead, he told her a story of a fox who got lost in the woods and kept walking because he believed someone was waiting for him at the end. Lily, sleepy but listening, asked, "Did someone wait?" Henry paused, then replied, "Yes. Someone had been waiting all along." She didn't ask who. She just smiled, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I think I'm the fox." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and said, "Then I guess I was the one waiting." And in that small, quiet room filled with soft light and the hum of the city below, it became more than just a temporary arrangement. It became something sacred, something worth protecting, no matter what came next. The morning of the court's family evaluation began like any other. Lily was up early, sitting at the breakfast bar in her pajamas, swinging her feet and coloring quietly while Henry made pancakes. She asked if she could help stir the batter, and he let her, even though she spilled flour across the counter. There was laughter, light conversation, and a rhythm between them that had taken weeks to build. But beneath the easy routine, Henry felt the pressure pressing behind his eyes. That afternoon, a court-appointed social worker would visit their home to assess the environment, observe their dynamic, and determine whether Henry's guardianship was healthy and in Lily's best interest. It wasn't about money or status, it was about trust, safety, and the invisible things that filled the space between a child and an adult who claimed to care. He had prepared meticulously. The apartment was spotless but still looked lived in, with drawings pinned to the refrigerator, a pair of small shoes near the door, and Lily's favorite books scattered gently across her bedroom rug. He didn't want perfection to scare the evaluator. He wanted authenticity. He dressed casually but neatly and told Lily that someone would be coming to visit them to see how they lived. She asked if she had to wear a dress, and he told her only if she wanted to. She chose a soft blue one and asked him to fix her hair. He braided it carefully, the way she liked, and tied the ribbon just right. When the social worker arrived, she was warm and professional, her eyes kind but observant. She greeted Lily first, kneeling to her level and introducing herself by her first name. Lily, shy but polite, invited her inside and offered to show her Bunny's favorite hiding spot. Henry stood back, letting her lead. The woman took her time, asking questions gently: what Lily liked to do after school, what made her feel safe, what bedtime looked like. Lily answered with quiet confidence. She spoke about pancakes and picture books, about their window seat talks, and how Henry made her laugh when he tried to sing lullabies off-key. Later, While Lily drew quietly at the table, the social worker asked Henry to step into the kitchen to speak privately. She reviewed the preliminary file, noting that Lily had shown signs of both resilience and past trauma but had improved in sleep patterns, emotional regulation, and school performance since coming into Henry's care. She asked about his history with Melanie, about why he hadn't known about the child before now, and about his motivations for pursuing full custody. Henry answered honestly, without rehearsed lines. He told her about Melanie's disappearance years ago, about how her sudden absence had left an unresolved wound in his life, and how finding Lily had changed everything. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He simply made it clear he was committed for life. The visit ended on a soft note. The social worker knelt once more beside Lily, who handed her a folded drawing. On it was a stick figure family of 2 people and a bunny holding hands beneath a giant heart. The caption read, in misspelled letters, "My home is here." The woman smiled and thanked her, then glanced back at Henry with an expression that said more than words could. She would file her report that night, but Henry already knew she had seen what mattered. The next morning, the court issued its preliminary review, the guardianship would stand, and the process toward full custody could proceed without challenge. Henry sat in silence when he received the email, the relief so overwhelming it felt almost hollow at first. He had been holding his breath for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to let it go. Lily was sitting nearby, playing with paper dolls. He walked over, sat on the floor beside her, and simply said, "They said yes." She blinked at him, confused. "Yes to what?" "Yes to you staying with me. Forever, if you want." She didn't answer with words. She crawled into his lap, rested her head on his chest, and whispered, "I already decided that a long time ago." That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the city shimmer with distant lights, and thought about everything that had changed. He still visited Melanie daily, still spoke to her even as machines hummed and monitors blinked steadily. He didn't know when, or if, she would wake. But if she did, he wanted her to know that Lily had not only been found, but she had been loved. Fiercely. Fully. Without condition. He turned to look back at the hallway where Lily's nightlight glowed gently under the door. A life that once existed only in theory, a concept he hadn't dared dream of, was now living, breathing, and fast asleep in the room next to his. And he knew, without question, that the court had only confirmed what his heart already understood. They were no longer waiting for permission to be a family. They already were one. Henry had just returned from Lily's school when he got the call from the hospital. It was short and cautious. Melanie had woken up. The doctor on the line warned him that she was weak, disoriented, and not fully coherent yet, but conscious. Henry stood in the middle of his kitchen, phone in hand, frozen. For a moment, the world around him blurred into silence. He looked toward Lily, who was sitting at the table, building a tower out of cereal boxes and carefully balancing her bunny on top. He didn't tell her right away. He didn't know how. But he packed her a small bag, called a trusted assistant to stay with her for a few hours, and headed to the hospital without hesitation. When he walked into Melanie's room, she looked smaller than he remembered, her skin pale against the sterile white sheets, her eyes fluttering slowly toward the window. The moment she turned her head and saw him, there was a flicker of recognition. Not fear. Not surprise. Something quieter. Maybe guilt. Maybe resignation. He stepped closer, careful not to overwhelm her. She watched him, then whispered, "You came." Henry pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "I never stopped," he said. "You disappeared. I didn't know where. And now you're here, and so is she." Melanie closed her eyes for a moment, as if the mention of Lily was too much to hold. When she opened them again, they were wet with tears. "I didn't mean to disappear," she said. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath. "I was scared. I thought I'd ruin you if you knew. I didn't want to be someone else who took something from you." Henry shook his head slowly. You didn't ruin me. But you did leave me out of the most important part of my life. And now she's everything. They sat in silence. Machines beeped quietly beside them. Melanie's hands trembled slightly as she tried to reach for a cup of water. Henry helped her. She sipped, then said, "Is she okay? Is she happy?" "Yes," he said. "She's thriving. She's smart, and strong, and cautious. But she smiles more now. She laughs. She asks about you every night." Melanie pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "I wanted to be better before I told you. But I never got better. And I didn't want her to grow up watching me fall apart." "You did what you thought you had to," Henry said. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Later that evening, he returned home to Lily, who ran into his arms the moment he walked through the door. She asked if he had gone to a meeting, and he hesitated before saying, "I saw someone very important." "Your mom." Her eyes widened, unsure whether to feel joy or fear. "She woke up," she whispered. He nodded. "She asked about you. She misses you." Lily clutched his hand tightly. "Can I see her?" Henry nodded again. "Soon. When she's a little stronger." In the days that followed, they spoke more often. Melanie's strength returned slowly. Henry visited her daily, updating her on Lily's routines, her favorite books, the way she hated broccoli and loved staying up too late. He brought her drawings, voice messages, even photos. Melanie wept the first time she heard Lily's voice say, "Hi, Mommy. I hope you're okay." "I'm okay. Daddy takes care of me." It was the first time either of them had heard her call Henry that aloud, Daddy. Eventually, Henry asked Melanie what she wanted for Lily's future. Her answer came without hesitation. "I want her to have peace. And I think you give her that. I'll never ask you to give her back. I just want to be whatever part of her life she'll let me be." Henry felt something shift in that moment. Not closure, not quite forgiveness, but a kind of understanding. They had both come through pain and shame and uncertainty, and now they stood, different, changed, but still willing to do what mattered most, love the same child in the best ways they could. That weekend, Henry and Lily sat in their apartment and put together a scrapbook. She carefully glued photos of them baking cookies, her first day at school, her stuffed bunny beside the window seat. Then she took a blank page and said, "This one's for Mommy." And Henry smiled, knowing they were making space, not just for the life they'd built, but for the ones they were still finding room to welcome in. On a warm Saturday afternoon, nearly 6 months after that day in the airport, Henry stood in the living room with his sleeves rolled up and a nervous energy pulsing just beneath his usually calm surface. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, lighting up the hardwood floors and casting gentle shadows across Lily's colorful artwork hanging in mismatched frames. Everything about the space was different now, no longer the home of a man who lived alone but the home of a family. The scent of fresh lilies and something sweet baking in the oven lingered in the air. In the other room, Lily was carefully arranging her stuffed animals in a row on the couch, all of them facing the hallway as though preparing for a ceremony. She was wearing a white dress with soft blue flowers and had insisted on tying her own shoes, crookedly, but proudly. Today was the day the adoption would be finalized. The papers had been signed, the court had approved everything, and all that remained was a simple in-person visit from a court officer to verify that Henry still intended to go through with the formal process. It was mostly symbolic, a last check before the document would be sealed and official. But for Henry, it felt like something much more. It felt like the final brick in a foundation he had spent months, years, really, building without knowing it. When the knock came at the door, Lily rushed to open it, her bunny tucked under one arm. The officer smiled warmly, greeted them both, and stepped inside with a clipboard and a light tone. The visit was short and pleasant, full of kind questions and even kinder remarks about how at ease Lily seemed in the home. After she left, Henry and Lily stood quietly in the center of the room. It was done. She was his. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. Officially. Legally. Forever. Lily looked up at him with her wide, thoughtful eyes. "So now I'm yours?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Henry crouched down and placed both hands on her small shoulders. "You've always been mine," he said. "Now it's just on paper too." She hugged him tightly, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like a space that had finally been filled with something real. That evening, they invited Melanie over for dinner for the first time since she'd regained her strength. She had moved to a new apartment nearby and was in outpatient treatment, working through years of pain with steady progress. She arrived with a small bouquet of sunflowers and a cautious smile, unsure how the night would go but hopeful. Lily greeted her with a drawing, herself in the middle, holding both Melanie's and Henry's hands, and led her to the table with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that love didn't have to be split. It could be shared. Dinner was simple: pasta, salad, and cupcakes that Lily had decorated with far too many sprinkles. They laughed, told stories, and looked at old pictures Melanie had brought of herself and Lily from years before. At one point, Melanie leaned across the table and said, "Thank you, Henry. For everything. For her. For not walking away." Henry nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you for bringing her into this world. I'm just lucky I got to find her in it." Later, after Melanie left and Lily had fallen asleep curled up beside her bunny and a new bedtime storybook, Henry stood in the doorway of her room, arms crossed, eyes damp. The soft glow of the nightlight shimmered across her face, peaceful in a way that made everything else fade. The court documents were on the desk behind him, neatly stacked and notarized. But he didn't need them anymore to feel what was true. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. The lights below flickered like distant stars, busy and cold, but here in this space, this warm, lived-in home, he had found something far more lasting than success. He had found a purpose that didn't need recognition, a kind of wealth that didn't show up on spreadsheets. And as he turned off the last light and whispered goodnight to the quiet apartment, he understood fully what he had once been too afraid to admit. He wasn't just a man who had stepped into a child's life. He was a father. Not by blood alone, but by every choice, every quiet promise, every moment of staying when it would have been easier to walk away. And that made him richer than he had ever dreamed possible. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is its quietness. There's no dramatic twist, no grand public gesture, just the steady, intimate triumph of love choosing to stay. Henry, a man once defined by control and detachment, becomes a father not through obligation, but through transformation. And that's what gives the story its depth. Lily isn't just a child in need, she's the catalyst that brings out the best in him. Her quiet resilience and trust teach Henry more about connection than any success ever did. The moment the adoption is finalized isn't the climax, it's the confirmation of everything that's already grown in between the silences, the late-night stories, the broken pancakes, and the gentle choices to keep showing up. For me, the beauty of this ending lies in how ordinary it is: one child sleeping peacefully, one man standing quietly in the doorway, knowing he's exactly where he's meant to be. It's not flashy. It's real. And sometimes, the most extraordinary endings are the ones built on simple, unwavering love. The billionaire CEO was on his way to the biggest deal of his life, until he found a crying toddler in his first-class seat, holding a letter with his name on it. Henry Winston moved through the private boarding gate like he had 1,000 times before, efficient, precise, and without emotion. His custom-tailored suit was crisp, his watch synchronized to Tokyo time, and his mind fully absorbed in the negotiation strategy he had mentally rehearsed the entire drive to the airport. This deal would be the biggest of his career. Billions were on the line, not just for the company but for his legacy. Everything had been coordinated to the minute. His assistant had ensured his favorite seat, 13A in first class, was reserved, and his files were loaded onto his tablet, ready for final review during the flight. There was nothing unpredictable about any of it. That was how Henry operated. Control was the foundation of his world. But as he stepped into the cabin and approached row 13, something jolted his routine. His seat was occupied. And not by a fellow executive or a misassigned passenger. A small child, a toddler, maybe 3 years old, was curled up in seat 13A, clutching a stuffed bear and crying softly into the fabric of the seatbelt. He wore a white cotton sweater that looked slightly too big for his tiny frame, and his shoes had clearly been taken off somewhere along the way. His face was flushed from crying, and his wide, tear-filled blue eyes locked onto Henry's with something that made the air catch in Henry's lungs. A flight attendant quickly approached, apologizing with visible confusion. She glanced down at the boy's boarding pass, then back up at Henry. The child's name wasn't listed under any reservation. There was no guardian on the manifest. No check-in alert. No explanation. Yet somehow, this boy had been assigned to seat 13A, Henry's seat. Security was being called. A gate agent was on their way. The captain had been notified. Henry should have been frustrated. He should have insisted on immediate resolution and moved on to another seat, focusing on the billion-dollar deal awaiting him across the ocean. But he didn't. Something stopped him. He didn't understand why, but instead of stepping back, he slowly sat down in seat 13B beside the child, watching him with growing unease. The boy had stopped crying now, but his lips still trembled. Clutched in his hand, almost unnoticed beneath the edge of his sleeve, was a folded piece of paper. A name was scribbled across the front in blue marker, Henry Winston. Henry's chest tightened as he reached out and gently took the letter, unfolding it with growing dread. The handwriting inside was uneven but familiar. He hadn't seen it in years, but he knew it instantly. Eliza. The letter was short, almost rushed, written with a shaking hand. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't go on. I'm sorry. His name is Thomas. He's yours. I had nothing left to give him, but you still have everything. Please don't leave him. For a moment, Henry couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. Eliza. The woman he had once loved but left behind when ambition took priority. They hadn't spoken in years. She had vanished from his life so completely that sometimes he wondered if she had ever really been in it at all. And now she was reaching out, not for herself, but for a child. His child. He looked back at the boy. Thomas. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The shape of his jaw. The curve of his eyebrows. Those bright blue eyes, Henry's mother used to say they were like glass marbles. He had the same. He felt the plane around him fade into the background, the murmurs of confused passengers, the rushed steps of crew members, the mechanical chime of the boarding door. All of it dissolved into a single, undeniable moment. A child had been placed in his seat, with his name on a letter, and no one else in the world coming for him. The flight was grounded. Security needed answers. But Henry wasn't thinking about Tokyo anymore. He was thinking about Eliza, about the choices he'd made, and the boy now resting quietly against the seat with tear stains on his cheeks. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A call. A second chance. And for the first time in years, Henry Winston didn't know what happened next. All he knew was that he wasn't getting on that flight. The terminal was quieter than usual once the flight to Tokyo officially closed its doors without him. Henry sat in a glass-walled observation area overlooking the runway, his suit jacket draped over the armrest of a chair that suddenly felt far too stiff. Thomas was asleep beside him, curled up in a fleece blanket one of the attendants had brought earlier, his head resting gently on Henry's lap. Every now and then, his small hand would twitch, fingers grasping for something even in sleep. Henry didn't move. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't check emails. All he could do was sit there, unmoving, as the weight of the letter burned in his pocket. The gate agents had done their job. They notified the airline security, called in social services, and double-checked the manifest for any trace of guardianship. Nothing turned up. The name, Eliza Morgan, had triggered a match in the system. She had purchased a ticket under her own name weeks earlier, but never boarded. No luggage. No contact. No one waiting on the other end. She had quite literally disappeared, leaving only the boy, the letter, and a signature that Henry hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. The social worker who arrived didn't recognize him at first. He introduced himself politely, clipboard in hand, prepared to follow procedure. But once he heard Henry's name, something shifted. Everyone knew who Henry Winston was. CEO. Public figure. Fortune covers. Forbes lists. The idea that this child, sitting with tear-dried cheeks and unmatched socks, could be his was not something the system was equipped to handle with quiet efficiency. Henry didn't care about protocol. All he wanted was to understand how it had come to this. How Eliza, independent, proud, complicated Eliza, could leave her son, their son, in an airplane seat with nothing but a note and a hope. And maybe, Henry realized, it wasn't really hope. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was love that had run out of places to go. The social worker explained the next steps. Custodial investigation. Emergency placement. Possible DNA confirmation. Paperwork. Court hearings. Henry nodded, understanding the process but already knowing the outcome. He didn't need a test. He could feel it in his bones, in the curve of the boy's cheek, in the instinct that had taken root the moment Thomas looked up at him. This wasn't a stranger's child. This was his son. And he wasn't going to let him vanish into a system. When Thomas woke up, he didn't cry. He simply sat up slowly, blinking at the bright lights above them, and looked at Henry with a strange sort of stillness. There was no fear in his expression. Just exhaustion and confusion, the kind only children who have lived through too much too soon can carry in their eyes. "Are we going home?" he asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. Henry didn't answer right away. The word home struck something deep in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Home wasn't the penthouse with glass walls and a view of the skyline. It wasn't boardrooms or chauffeurs or curated dinners with investors. Home was wherever Thomas felt safe. And if Henry had any chance of becoming that place, he'd take it. "We're going somewhere safe," he said carefully. "Somewhere just for us." He took Thomas's hand, small, warm, still sticky from the juice box he'd been given earlier, and led him out of the terminal. His driver looked startled when he saw them, but didn't ask questions. Henry gave him a new address, one he hadn't said out loud in years. His mother's old house. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood an hour outside the city, a place he had visited every summer as a boy before life pulled him into the current of ambition. The house had sat empty since she passed, its windows shuttered and garden overgrown. But it was still standing, still full of echoes, and still waiting. That night, Henry laid Thomas down on the old guestroom bed and sat beside him until his breathing steadied into sleep. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't call Tokyo. He just sat there, watching the boy who had arrived in his life like a storm, quiet on the surface, but deep enough to reshape everything. Outside the window, the wind stirred through the tall grass. Inside, Henry Winston, for the first time in his life, did not feel like a man chasing success. He felt like a man trying to become someone worth coming home to. The days that followed moved with an unfamiliar kind of slowness, as if time itself had paused to make room for something entirely new. Henry woke up early each morning, not to check the markets or prepare for a video conference, but because Thomas was stirring in the next room, murmuring softly in his sleep or padding barefoot across the hardwood floors looking for breakfast. The boy's presence filled the quiet house in a way that unsettled and soothed Henry at once. It had been years since he had lived with anyone else. He was used to silence, to perfect order. But now, every surface was slowly being taken over by scattered toys, stray crumbs, and the warm chaos of a child learning to feel safe. Henry made cereal on the first morning. He poured too much milk, used the wrong kind of spoon, and handed it to Thomas without realizing the bowl was freezing from the fridge. The boy didn't complain. He simply sat at the old wooden table, swinging his legs, and ate quietly, glancing up at Henry now and then as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Henry sat across from him, still in yesterday's shirt, unsure of what to say or do, except that he couldn't look away. Every movement Thomas made felt surreal. It was like watching a distant memory play out in front of him, familiar, yet painfully new. In the afternoon, Henry took Thomas into town to buy him clothes, something warm, shoes that fit. The boy held his hand without being asked. At the store, the clerk tried to make small talk. "Is this your grandson?" And Henry's response caught even him by surprise. "He's my son." The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he had never said them before. He saw Thomas's face turn slightly toward him at that moment, his eyes widening just a little. The boy didn't speak, but something shifted in the air between them, a thin thread of connection pulling tighter. That evening, after Thomas fell asleep curled up on the couch, Henry walked outside into the cool dusk and sat on the front steps of the house, staring at the overgrown garden. He hadn't been back here in so long. The last time, he had been too busy, too impatient, too distracted by things that now felt embarrassingly hollow. He had missed so much. Not just the years he could have had with Eliza, but the little things, the first smile, the first word, the nights with fevers, the early drawings hung proudly on a wall. He thought about Eliza constantly. What had she gone through? What had driven her to that final decision, to put her son on a plane alone, carrying only a letter and a memory? She had always been strong, sharp, unwilling to be pitted or caged. She had loved fiercely, and he had once believed that would last forever, until he let ambition drown out everything else. Now all he had was the son she left behind, and the guilt that maybe, if he had stayed, things would have been different. But guilt wasn't useful anymore. Thomas didn't need apologies. He needed presence. Stability. Patience. Love. Henry didn't know how to be a father. Not really. But he knew how to stay. And that, he was beginning to realize, was more than enough to start with. The next day, he called the attorney handling the emergency guardianship process. He didn't want temporary custody. He wanted it permanent. He wanted every signature, every form, every evaluation needed to make it official. There were court dates to schedule, documents to file, a DNA test to confirm what his heart already knew. He'd go through all of it. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. When he came home that evening, Thomas ran to him with a drawing clutched in one hand. It was crude, drawn in thick crayon lines, but unmistakable. A tall man holding the hand of a small boy beneath a crooked sun. Above them, in uneven letters, was written one word, Dad. Henry knelt down, took the picture, and looked at Thomas. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just pulled the boy into a gentle hug, not too tight, but close enough to feel how real he was. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, Henry stood by the door of Thomas's room and watched him sleep. He didn't feel lost anymore. He didn't feel unsure. He felt chosen. And that changed everything. By the fourth week, the house no longer felt like a place Henry had returned to, it felt like a place being rewritten, one memory at a time. The silence that once echoed through the halls was now filled with footsteps too small to be heard unless you were listening closely. Thomas had taken to singing softly to himself in the mornings, a series of made-up tunes that always changed but somehow made perfect sense to him. The house, once a monument to a life of order and ambition, now bore signs of imperfection that Henry found strangely comforting: a sock under the coffee table, fingerprints on the glass doors, a crayon drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet that used to hold tax forms. Henry was learning how to adjust, not in grand gestures, but in 100 tiny, humbling ways. He had learned that Thomas hated the smell of eggs and loved apples with the skin peeled. He knew the boy needed 2 stories before bed, no matter how tired he was. He knew Thomas was afraid of loud toilets and that he would only wear pajamas with animals on them. He also knew that the nightmares came twice a week, always just before midnight, and that the boy would call for him softly, unsure if it was okay to wake him. Henry never hesitated. He would come into the room, sit on the edge of the bed, and rub his back until the fear melted away. There were no speeches, no explanations. Just presence. And slowly, that presence was becoming something Thomas could rely on. During the days, Henry began to navigate the unfamiliar world of early childhood. He enrolled Thomas in a local preschool under a temporary guardianship agreement and met with teachers who asked him about routines, favorite toys, food allergies, emotional triggers. He answered as best he could, filled out forms he never imagined completing, and sat through orientation meetings where he was just another parent in a room full of people balancing snacks and toddlers and exhaustion. And surprisingly, he didn't feel out of place. He felt human. Grounded. He had spent years at the top of skyscrapers, giving speeches about vision and strategy, but here, among sticky tables and alphabet charts, he felt closer to something real than he ever had in his glass office. The case with social services moved forward. The DNA test came back, confirmation of paternity, though Henry hadn't needed proof. The official custody process had begun, and while it might take weeks or months to finalize, no one questioned his commitment. The system, cautious as it was, recognized when someone showed up not for obligation but because they refused to leave. Amber, the social worker assigned to their case, was young but sharp, with kind eyes and a steady voice. She visited often to check on Thomas, but also on Henry. She asked about routines, about emotional bonding, about Henry's long-term plans. At first, he gave calculated answers, logical, structured, well-reasoned. But as time passed, his answers changed. He spoke not about plans, but about moments. About how Thomas hugged him tighter every week. About how bedtime had become his favorite part of the day. About how the boy had begun calling him Dad without hesitation. Amber listened, took notes, and once, after a particularly quiet visit, said something that stayed with him: sometimes, love doesn't need a timeline. It just needs proof that you're still there. Henry carried those words with him. They reminded him that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be consistent. When Thomas cried over broken toys, he didn't try to fix them right away. He listened first. When the boy laughed too loudly in restaurants, he didn't hush him. He laughed too. When Thomas asked why his mommy couldn't come back, Henry didn't offer false hope. He held him and told the truth, that she had loved him, that she had done her best, and that now, it was Henry's job to make sure he never had to feel that alone again. One night, after Thomas had fallen asleep with his arms wrapped around a toy firetruck, Henry sat in the living room with a cup of tea, looking through old photos he had dug out of a forgotten box in the attic. Most were of his childhood, his mother, a few blurry shots of Eliza. In one photo, she was sitting in the grass, barefoot, her eyes closed, sunlight on her face. He stared at it for a long time, guilt and love mingling in a way that made his chest ache. He whispered a thank you he knew she would never hear. Not just for Thomas, but for trusting him, even after everything. As the fire crackled and the house settled into night, Henry realized he no longer felt like a man pausing his life for someone else. He wasn't on a break from success. He wasn't waiting to return to what he had lost. He was building something new. Something that didn't need applause, only love. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Winter crept in slowly, wrapping the town in early darkness and cold mornings that required extra blankets and gloves too small for Henry to figure out without help. Life had found a rhythm now, and while it was far from easy, it was no longer unfamiliar. Thomas had started calling the house our place, and each time he said it, Henry felt something shift quietly inside him, like the foundation of his life was settling into place for the first time. The days were filled with school drop-offs, grocery runs, bedtime routines, and small miracles, a laugh after a tantrum, a picture drawn with "Dad" written at the top, the soft weight of a child falling asleep against his chest during a movie he hadn't planned to watch. One gray morning, while Henry was helping Thomas zip up his jacket, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. Very few people knew where they lived now, and Henry had intentionally kept it that way. When he opened the door, he was met with a woman in a long black coat, her expression professional but unreadable. She introduced herself as Rachel Myers, a lawyer representing a man named Curtis, Eliza's former partner, someone Henry had never met but had heard about in vague, uncomfortable tones. Rachel handed Henry an envelope containing legal documents. Curtis was filing a petition. He wanted joint custody of Thomas, claiming he had played a parental role in the boy's early life and had the right to continue doing so. Henry's entire body went still. He thanked her without emotion, closed the door, and locked it behind him, as if that simple gesture could keep the outside world from coming in. He read the documents slowly, twice, then a third time. The words felt sharp and clinical, filled with accusations that boiled down to one thing: doubt. Curtis claimed Henry had no real connection to Thomas, that he had shown up late, that his motivation was rooted in guilt, not love. The petition painted a version of the story Henry didn't recognize, one where he was a stranger to his son, where the bond they had built was nothing more than a temporary solution to a tragic inconvenience. Henry didn't tell Thomas. He didn't know how. The boy was still too young to understand the machinery of the legal system, too young to grasp the idea that someone might try to take him away. But Henry understood. He knew the courts would ask questions. They would examine his life, his decisions, his past. They would look for weakness, for gaps in consistency, for signs that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough. The next few days felt heavier. Thomas noticed the tension even if he didn't understand it. He started waking up more at night, asking if Henry would still be there in the morning. He drew pictures with darker colors. His questions became more pointed: why don't I have a mom anymore? Why do other kids have two houses? Henry answered as honestly as he could without unraveling. He told Thomas that not all families looked the same, but that didn't make them any less real. He told him that love was not about matching stories, it was about showing up every day, no matter what. Henry called Amber, the social worker, and they met in the dining room while Thomas was at school. She listened as he explained everything, her brow furrowed, her hands calm around a mug of tea. When he finished, she sighed and said, "Custody battles like this aren't uncommon, but they're always hard. You've done everything right so far, but the courts won't just look at that. They'll look at the past. They'll ask why you weren't there before." Henry nodded. "Because I didn't know. And now that I do, I'm not leaving." Amber didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then keep showing them that. Not just the court, Thomas too." With her guidance, Henry gathered everything. Photos. School records. Letters from teachers. Notes from Thomas. Even the drawing that still hung on the refrigerator. He submitted character references. He met with child psychologists. He told his story without embellishment, just truth. The hearing was scheduled for mid-December. As the date approached, Henry found himself slowing down in the evenings. He would sit longer with Thomas after bedtime stories, run his fingers through the boy's hair, and memorize the shape of his breathing. He stopped checking his email entirely. The only schedule he followed was the one that revolved around school lunches and morning hugs. One night, while they sat on the couch watching a holiday cartoon, Thomas looked up and said, "If they make me go away, can I come back anyway?" Henry's heart cracked clean down the middle. He took the boy into his arms, held him tight, and whispered, "No one is taking you away. Not while I'm here." And he meant it. Every word. Because love, Henry had come to learn, was not always enough to stop pain. But it was enough to stand in front of it, hold the line, and refuse to let it win. The courthouse was gray and quiet on the morning of the hearing. Snow had started falling just before dawn, blanketing the streets in a thin, untouched layer that seemed to slow everything down. Henry arrived early, dressed in a dark suit that felt heavier than it used to, not because of the fabric, but because of the weight of everything it represented now. He wasn't here as a CEO or a public figure. He was here as a father, one who had spent every day for the last 2 months building something out of nothing, learning how to love a child who had been a stranger to him, and trying to become someone that child could count on without question. Amber met him at the entrance. She had a folder tucked under one arm and a tired but reassuring look in her eyes. They walked through the halls together in silence until they reached the family courtroom, a modest space with worn benches and soft lighting that felt more like a waiting room than a battlefield. On the far side of the room sat Curtis, the man who had filed the petition. He was taller than Henry expected, dressed well, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Henry. He just sat beside his lawyer, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge entered shortly after and asked for both sides to present their cases. Curtis's lawyer went first, reading from a prepared statement filled with vague but pointed claims. He painted Curtis as a long-time emotional presence in Thomas's life, someone who had stepped in when no one else did. He spoke of Eliza with respect, but also as someone overwhelmed by her circumstances. He implied that Henry had stepped in only when things became convenient and that his relationship with Thomas, though well-meaning, lacked foundation. Henry listened without interrupting. He didn't flinch when the lawyer described him as emotionally unavailable, or when he questioned the sincerity of Henry's motives. He had prepared for this. He had expected it. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from a statement. He stood, looked directly at the judge, and spoke from the place where all of this had begun. He told the truth. He told them how he hadn't known Thomas existed until the moment he saw him on that plane. How the boy had been left with nothing but a note and his name. How he had taken him home not out of guilt or responsibility, but out of something deeper, something he didn't have words for then but understood now, instinct, connection, the overwhelming feeling that this child belonged to him, not because of blood, but because of the bond that had formed in the weeks since. He talked about bedtime routines and scraped knees, about early mornings filled with cereal and coloring books, about the way Thomas had started calling him Dad without ever being asked to. He didn't cry, though his voice caught once, when he said, "This isn't something I'm doing for Thomas. This is something we're building together. Every single day. He's not my obligation. He's my son." After his testimony, Amber presented her report. She spoke of Thomas's progress, of the emotional stability he had gained, of the strength of the relationship she had observed between them. She referenced the letters from Thomas's teachers, the consistent involvement in his life, and the way Henry had chosen to change the course of his entire world just to stay close to one little boy. The psychologist echoed her report, noting that removing Thomas from Henry's care at this stage would likely cause more harm than any possible benefit. The judge asked a few final questions, then called a short recess. Henry stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the wall near a vending machine that flickered weakly in the corner. He felt empty, not from fatigue, but from the emotional cost of having to prove something he already knew in his bones. He wanted to be back home. He wanted to pick up Thomas from school and take him to the park and read him the same story 3 times in a row just because he asked. He didn't want to fight anymore. He just wanted to live. When the court reconvened, the judge returned with her ruling. Her tone was measured, but her words were clear. Curtis's petition was denied. Legal custody would remain with Henry, and the court recognized him as the primary guardian with full parental rights. There was no applause. No dramatic moment of celebration. Just quiet stillness and the sound of Henry releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Later that day, when he picked Thomas up from school, the boy ran toward him with the same unfiltered joy he always had. Henry knelt, caught him mid-run, and held him close, letting the cold air sting his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't explain what had happened in court. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Let's go home." And Thomas, smiling wide and warm against his shoulder, whispered back, "Our home." That was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the custody ruling felt like stepping into a new season of life, one Henry hadn't known he was waiting for. The tension that had quietly lived beneath the surface of every moment was finally gone. No more court dates. No more paperwork. No more watching every move with the fear that someone would question whether he belonged in his son's life. What remained was routine, not the kind dictated by business calendars and global meetings, but the kind made up of school pickups, spilled juice, bedtime laughter, and tiny socks that never stayed in pairs no matter how often he tried to organize them. Thomas had begun to change too. The fear in his eyes, the caution in his tone, the slight flinch when someone raised their voice, all of it began to fade. He smiled more, talked more, asked more questions. He had started drawing daily, pictures of their house, of the two of them holding hands, of rockets and dogs and sometimes things he couldn't explain but always called ours. Henry kept every one, taping them to the walls, the fridge, even the mirror in the hallway, until their home felt less like a restored memory and more like a living scrapbook of a boy reclaiming his childhood. Amber visited one last time for a final check-in. She walked through the house slowly, noting how Thomas clung to Henry's leg in a playful way, how naturally he moved through the space, how he pointed to his own room as "my spot" with a pride that was impossible to fake. She sat down with Henry in the kitchen after Thomas had gone outside to chase leaves in the wind and told him simply, "You did it." Not because the court said so, but because he did. He trusts you. And that's all the proof that ever mattered. Henry didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to praise that felt so personal. But Amber wasn't the type to linger. She left him with a signed document and a smile that didn't need words. That night, Henry made spaghetti from scratch for the first time. It was messy, wildly uneven, and Thomas declared it, kinda weird but still yummy. They ate sitting on the floor of the living room because the table was covered in Lego creations they had both agreed were too important to move. After dinner, they built a blanket fort. It wasn't very sturdy, and Henry bumped his head twice, but they read books inside it until Thomas fell asleep against his chest, breathing softly, fingers still tangled in the edge of Henry's shirt like a child who finally knew he was safe. In the quiet of that moment, Henry looked around at the chaos of pillows, books, and mismatched blankets, and realized he no longer missed the skyline view from his penthouse. He no longer felt the urge to check stock reports or performance projections. He didn't crave the approval of investors or the thrill of closing another impossible deal. He had traded all of that for something far simpler and infinitely more profound, a life made up of presence, of shared moments, of unconditional love offered without expectation. He thought of Eliza more gently now. Not with guilt, but with gratitude. She had made the hardest decision of her life to ensure that Thomas had a chance. And somewhere deep in his bones, Henry believed she would have been proud of how it turned out. Not because he had done everything right, but because he hadn't run. Because he had stayed. As winter melted into early spring, Henry and Thomas began walking to school instead of driving. They talked about everything and nothing, about frogs and clouds and whether cereal should be cold or hot. On weekends, they worked on the backyard together, planting tiny seedlings that Thomas insisted would grow into trees taller than the house. Henry didn't argue. He let the boy believe in magic because, for the first time in his life, he kind of believed in it too. He was still learning how to be a father. There were mistakes, impatience, moments when he questioned himself. But there was no more doubt about whether he belonged in this life. He did. And every day, Thomas showed him that being a parent wasn't about doing it all perfectly. It was about being the one who stays, who listens, who shows up again and again. And Henry, a man who had once built towers out of steel and glass, was now building something even stronger, one bedtime story, one school project, one whispered, "I love you," at a time. Spring arrived quietly, with rain that soaked the streets and small bursts of green pushing up through the earth like promises. The world outside was waking up again, but inside Henry's home, it felt like something had already bloomed. There was a calmness in the way the mornings began now, a rhythm to the life they'd created that no longer felt temporary or fragile. It was real. Thomas had stopped asking questions like, "Will I stay here?" or "Are you leaving?" Instead, he talked about summer plans and whether they could build a treehouse, if maybe they could get a dog, and if Henry would come to his school talent show even if he didn't win anything. Henry said yes to all of it. They no longer needed the nightlight. Thomas no longer needed the lullabies whispered at midnight to fall back asleep. But sometimes, Henry still sat beside his bed, not because the boy needed it, but because he did. He had once feared he wouldn't know how to love someone unconditionally, that the years he had spent living for ambition had made him too hard, too distant, too unfit for something as soft and pure as fatherhood. But now, as he watched Thomas grow, taller, more confident, filled with opinions and imagination, he understood that love had reshaped him entirely. It had reached places no success ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Henry received a letter in the mail, one that caught him off guard. It was handwritten, postmarked from a small town he didn't recognize. Inside was a note from Eliza's sister, someone he had never met. The letter wasn't long. It simply said, "I don't know what happened between you and Eliza. She never talked much about the past. But I do know she loved that boy more than anything, and that she made the hardest choice a mother ever could. I think she'd want you to know that she hoped you'd find each other. Thank you for not turning away." Henry sat with that letter for a long time. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small piece of grace, from someone who had known Eliza when he hadn't. It didn't change what had happened, and it didn't ease the ache that sometimes still settled in his chest when he thought of her. But it gave him something else, closure, or at least a kind of peace. Later that day, Thomas found him sitting alone in the kitchen, the letter folded on the table. The boy climbed into his lap and, without asking what was wrong, wrapped his arms around Henry's neck. They stayed like that for a while. No questions, no explanations. Just a father and a son, holding each other in the quiet certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. That evening, Henry cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, Thomas's favorite. They ate on the porch, watching the rain taper off into a light drizzle. Thomas asked if they could go somewhere together in the summer, maybe a beach or a mountain or even just a cabin in the woods. He didn't care where, as long as it was with Henry. And Henry promised they would, that they'd go anywhere he wanted. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the time. Before bed, Thomas handed Henry a new drawing. This one had more detail than usual, trees, a swing, a little red house with a sun above it. Two figures stood in front, one tall, one small. Both smiling. Above them, in blocky crayon letters, were the words, "Our beginning." Henry hung it next to the others. He no longer thought about the life he used to live, not with longing, not even with regret. That life had ended the moment he saw a crying child in seat 13A, holding a letter with his name on it. Everything that came after that wasn't a detour. It was the real path, the one he hadn't known existed. Now, he didn't wake up chasing deadlines. He woke up to little feet on the stairs, to sleepy voices asking for pancakes, to a life that was quieter, smaller, but infinitely more full. He had once believed that his legacy would be the buildings he left behind, the empire he built from nothing. But as he stood in Thomas's doorway that night, watching the boy drift to sleep with peace on his face and crayons still scattered across the bed, he realized that this was the only legacy that mattered. And in the deepest part of him, Henry knew he hadn't just saved Thomas. Thomas had saved him too. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is how quietly it speaks. It doesn't need a grand twist or a dramatic climax, because the real transformation happens slowly, through presence, patience, and love. Henry's journey from detached executive to devoted father is not only believable, it's deeply moving. It shows that healing doesn't come from fixing the past, but from choosing to show up fully in the present. The most touching part, for me, is how the story honors both the child's innocence and the adult's capacity for change. Thomas isn't just a symbol of redemption, he's a whole person who teaches Henry how to be human again. And Henry, despite his flaws and late start, earns something money could never buy: trust, connection, and the right to be called Dad. It's a reminder that the most meaningful legacies aren't built in boardrooms or measured in billions. They're built in bedtime stories, kitchen table drawings, and the quiet promise to never walk away.